welcome back to my video. So in this video, we are going to continue with our job board application using Flutter, Riverpod for state management, Express, and MongoDB for our backend. Right. So in this video now, we are going to be working on the resumes. Right. So we are going to retrieve the resume. We are going to put the delete function. We are going to implement the delete function where you can delete your resume. And also you can also add another a resume, right? You can pick it in the form of PDF and then you can upload it to our server, right? So if I pull out Postman, you can see this is our Postman right here. So if I send a GET request, you can see that we have the ID and then we have the resume title and then we have the resume itself, the user ID, the date at which the resume was created, or the date at which it was updated it, right? All right, so without wasting much time, let's start writing our code. Let's start writing code, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to open Visual Studio. So inside Visual Studio, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another folder inside our features folder, right? Which is going to be resumes, right? And then, so we need the model. Then we also need the controller. And then we also need the repository folder. And then we also need a screen folder. Also need a screen folder. And then we also need a widgets folder, right? Widgets folder, okay. All right, so now what we are basically going to do is we are going to start with the resume model. So we are going to start with the resume model. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to go inside our vacancy model, and then I'm simply going to copy everything inside our vacancy model, right? I'm just going to copy this file, and then inside the resumes model folder, let's create a file called resume model. So I'll simply paste in the code, and then what I'm simply going to do here is I'm going to change this to resume model, and then let's do it also here. Let's also change it to resume model, and then for the constructor, we're simply going to change it again to resume model. Then let's change this again to resume model, and then resume model also. All right, so now that we are done with this, we also need to change this to resume model. All right, so now that we are done, we also need to change this, the part file, right? So we need to change it to resume. Then also this part again. All right, so inside our vacancy model, what we simply need to do is we need to copy the raised import statement, right? So let's copy it and let's paste it above there. Okay. All right, so the first thing that we need to do, we need an ID, right? So our ID, if we go inside if we open Postman, you can see that our ID starts with underscore, right? But with Flutter, we cannot create variables with underscore. All right, so basically what we are going to do inside our constructor, right? We are simply going to use a JSON key, right? So a JSON key, and then we pass in the name. Then the name is going to be simply underscore ID, right? And then it's going to be a string of type ID. All right. And then what we need also, we need the title also. Yeah, so we also need a title. And then we also need a user ID, right? We also need a user ID. All right, and then we also need a resume, right? All right, so now that we are done, everything is done now. So here, let's just put a comma. Everything is done now. So what this JSON key just does, it maps our underscore to just to our variable ID, right? All right, so the other thing that you should note is that you can see that under resume we have uploads resumes, and then but we don't have this base URL right there, right? But we also need it to have like an HTTP, because the library that we are going to use to retrieve resume needs an HTTP, right? So basically, to work on that, what we're going to do is we're simply going to use we are simply going to extend our resume model class, right? Just call it on resume model, right? Then we just create a getter. So we just call this full resume path, right? Full resume path. Resume path is equals to app config, right? Because we need the URL, right? App config dot full resume URL, and then we'll get the resume, right? Okay, so I don't know why it's not saying resume is not defined, but we have already defined it, right? Resume extension or resume model, git config. Right, so basically what we can simply do is let's run that run build runner to generate our model classes, right? So we need an right. Okay, so let's run it again. Okay, now you can see that everything is working. Now we have the resume model freezed and model.g.dat, right? We have generated our model class, right? All right, so now we are done with the model part. Now it's time for us to move to our resume repository. So let's go inside our resumes, and then repository. Let's change to resume repository, right? Resume repository. Repository.dat, right? So let's create a class resume repository, right? All right, so right now the first thing that we need a HTTP. We need an HTTP client, right? And then the second one is we need a local auth repository. Local auth repository. And then we need to create like a constructor, right? And then we just bind our HTTP client, right? And then we also need to bind our local auth repository. All right, so basically what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to bind in our client. Going to bind in our client to our client, and also our local repository to local repository, right? All right. So it's not supposed to, it's just local auth repository, not local auth repository provider, right? Okay, it's supposed to be small letter L, okay. So now that we are done, now what we can simply do is let's import HTTP, the HTTP package from making HTTP calls, right? Now what we are simply going to do is we'll create a method for uploading our resume. All right, so now what we simply do is we'll create a type of future. Then if you still remember, we have been using fp.either, and then we are simply going to display like a failure message if there is a failure. Then if there is a success, what we'll simply going to just display our resume, right? So now let's just import let's say this is supposed to be resume model, right? All right, so we just name it upload resume. All right, so let's just make sure this is kept error. All right, so this is going to be an asynchronous function, right? So what do we need here? The first thing is our resume. We are going to upload a file, so we just call file resume, and then our resume title, right? And then we also need a user ID, right? So now we're simply going to import the .io package, right? Okay, so now that we are done, now the first thing that we need to do here is we need to create our request header. So it's going to be a map of type string, right? And then we're simply going to name it request headers. And then it's going to be a map, and then it's going to be accept function, and then we are simply going to accept an application /JSON, right? And then we also need an authorization, right? We also need an authorization. So our authorization is going to be like a bearer token. So we are going to get it from our local auth repository. So it's going to be from local auth repository.get. We are going to get the user's token, right? So now we are done with our request header. Now we need to create our URL. So our URL is going to be URI.http from the HTTP function, right? And then we need to pass in the best URL at first, and then we will then pass in our route, which is going to be appconfig.resume URL. So it's going to point to the endpoint where we are going to upload our resume, right? Then we're going to create another variable for making a request, right? So when we are dealing with files, normally the files we upload them using HTTP multipath, right? So it's going to be http.multipath file, right? Multipath file, and then we need it from path because it's going to come from a path, right? So the path is going to be resume, right? So if we go back to our if we go back to Postman, right, you can see this is the path where we want to upload our resume. So resume, just make sure that it's correct, right? So resume, and then here the path, we just need get the path from our resume dot path, right? Okay, and then what we also need to do is we also need to add our request headers. So we say request dot headers. So we'll say request dot so it's not giving us an error. I don't know why. It's going to be multi-part. Okay, it's supposed to be http.multipart request, not file. Multi-part request. So let's just get rid of this. It's going to be multi-part request, right? And then our request is going to be of type, it's going to be a post request, right? And then we need now to pass in the URI, right? So URI dot pass. So we are simply going to pass in our URL dot toString, right? All right. So now what we simply now we have to do is request dot files, right? And then dot add. So now we are going to add. Before add, we are simply going to await because we are adding files, right? HTTP dot multi-part file, right? Multi-part file dot from path, right? So the path is going to be our resume, and then here we are going to pass in the resume, right? Okay, so now that we are done, now we need to add also our request headers, right? So request.headers.add all, right? So what we're simply going to add here is we are simply going to add in request headers, right? And then after that, we also need to add some fields, right? So request.fields. So pass in the user ID. That's another field that we need, right? User ID, which is equal to our user ID. And then also need to pass in the resume title, right? So it's going to be title. And then it's simply going to be title, right? And then after this, what we simply need to do is we need to create a try catch block, right? So let's create a try catch block, right? So now we simply need to catch any error, and then like this, right? All right, so the first thing that we are going to do here is we need to create like a stream response, right? Stream response, which is equal to, we are going to await, and then we are going to await the request, and then we are simply going to send it, right? Then after this, what we need is we need to get a response, right? So the response is we are going to just await HTTP dot response, right? We are going to await the response, and then we are going to await the response from our stream, right? And then the stream, and then we'll just pass in stream response there, right? And then after that is we can simply get our data. So to get our data, we simply have to first we decode our JSON object, right? We decode our JSON object from our response.body. Right. So we decoded from our response.body. So now we need to check if our response.status code is equal to 200. Right, so that means that if it's equal to 200, that means we have a successful response. So if to 200, we'll simply return right as is to remember, we use the right side to just represent if the response is successful, right? Then I'll simply say resume model from JSON, and then we'll pass in our data, our data object there. And then else that means we have an error, right? So if we have an error, we're simply going to return left, right, from fp dot, and then here we simply have to pass in up failure, and then the message is going to be data and then message. All right, and then here what we simply have to do is we simply have to return our left, and then we'll then pass in up failure, and then the message is simply going to be e.toString, right? So it's not supposed to be, it's supposed to be error.toString, right? So now that's our method for uploading our resume, right? We are done with the first method for uploading our resume, right? So now the second method that we need to deal with is the method for getting our resumes, right? So it's just getting resumes, right? So we'll create a method of type future, and then type either, and then if there is an error, we are simply going to display that error. Else we are simply going to just return a list of resumes, right? So list of resume model, and then we'll just call it get user resumes, and then we'll simply pass in the user ID. Then it's going to be an asynchronous function, and then what we simply have to do there is it's going to be a map type string, and then request headers. And then we're simply going to accept any request that is going to be type application/JSON. All right, and then also need an authorization, right? It's going to be a bearer token, and then simply passing our local auth repository get user token right there, right? All right, so now that we are done, so now we need the URL. So the URL is going to be URI.http, right? And then we're simply going to pass in app config.base. We are going to pass in the base URL, right? And then now what we're simply going to do is we are simply going to pass in our app config resume URL, right? Resume URL, and then /$, and then we'll simply attach a user ID to it, right? And then after this, we'll then get a response, right, from our server. So to get a response, we are simply going to await a get request, and then we'll pass in the URL, and then headers, which is going to be our request headers there. All right, so now that we are done, now we simply get data variable, which is going to be JSON decode. We are simply going to decode our response from our body, right? Response.body. right there. Right, so now what we're simply going to do is let's create a try catch block. Then we are going to check if our response dot status code is equal to 200, right? So that means that our request is successful. And then if our request is successful, what we're simply going to do is we are simply going to return right, and then resumes from JSON, and then pass in our data object, right? And then if else, that means we do not get a 200 status code, that means that there's an error. We're simply going to return left, and then we are simply going to display a message, right? And then the message, we are simply going to get it from our body, then right, and then we are simply going to catch the error if there's an error here, right? So we're simply going to catch it, and then we're also going to return a left, and then we're simply going to pass in app failure, then data, and then message. All right, so we are done with the method for getting user resume. Now the other method that we are going to work with is deleting our resume, right? So we are going to delete our resume. So what I was simply going to do here, I'm going to copy this get user resume method, right? And then I'm simply going to paste it here, and I'm going to modify it. So I'm going to change it to delete user resume, right? And takes in the user ID, and then here what we simply need to do is let's get rid of this, because we don't need to return a list, just need to return a message, right? Which is going to be a success response there. And then we need to change this from get method to delete, right? So this request, we need to change it to delete. And then here what we're simply going to do is we are going to return a success response, right? Success response, just a message from the server, right? With just a message from the server. Yeah, so basically that's it now with our resume repository. Now the last thing that's left is for us to create a provider so that we can access it inside our resume controller, right? So let's just create a resume repository provider, right? Resume repository provider, which is going to equal to our provider, right? And then what we're simply going to do is takes in a reference here. Then what we're simply going to do is we're going to resume repository, and then for the client we are simply going to watch reference to watch HTTP provider, right? And then for the local auth repository also, we just need to watch local auth repository provider right there. So now that we are done, let's save it. Okay, so now that we are done, now the next thing is we are going to work on the resume controller, right? And then also implementing the logic inside our user interface. Okay, so now let's start working on our controller, right? So if we go inside our resumes controller folder, we'll just create a file and we'll just name it resume controller that, right? And then the class is going to be resume controller, and I want it to extend a sync notifier, and then want the async notifier to return like a list of resume. So it's going to be resume model. All right, and then now what we need to do here is we need to import the resume model right here, and then we need to create our build function, right? So our build function is going to be of type future, and then a list resume model. Okay, and then first thing that we need to do here is we need to initialize our resume repository, right? So resume repository, and then resume repository, and then also we need to do that for our local auth repository, right? It's going to be underscore local auth repository, right? And then we are going to set our local auth repository, and then we're simply going to watch for that provider, right, which is a local auth repository provider. Right there, we are going to do the same foot again for our resume provider, resume repository, which is equal to a reference.watch, right, resume repository provider, right? Okay, so now that we are done, what we first need to do is a method for uploading our resume. It's going to be a method of type future, and then we are going to upload the file. Then we also need title. Then we also need the user ID. And then we also need a build context so that we can display X snack bar, right, to show the user if it's successful or not. Right, so this method is going to be an asynchronous method, right? So basically what we need to do here is let's import the file. Let's import file .io, and then what we're simply going to do is we're going to create a variable res, and then we're simply going to await our resume repository, and then we need to upload the resume, right? And then after this, basically what we need to do is let's create another variable, and then it's going to be a switch statement, and takes in a resume for res function, right? And then after this, we are simply going to return a write. So if the upload was successful, we'll simply show a snack bar. We simply display a snack bar with a message that the upload was successful, right? So with error, and then if there is an error from our backend, we'll simply also show another snack bar. So here we just need to change it to left, and then L, and then what we simply need to do is let's import the fp.dat package, right? So it's converted to a string, and then let's also convert this to a string, right? Okay, so okay, so forgot, it's supposed to be upload resume. All right, so we are done with this method. Now we need a method for getting our resumes, right? So basically what we are simply going to do here, let's create a future of type list resume model, type resume model, and then let's just get the resumes, and string user ID, right? and then we just simply pass the user ID, and then after this we are simply going to return a switch statement with our response res function, and then left, and then value, and then what we're simply going to do here is we're simply going to show a snack bar. Let's just show snack bar. Okay, so let's just throw in, right? Let's just throw an error, and then if successful, what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to just return the list of resumes, right? Just going to return a list of resumes like this. All right, so now that we are done with this, what we simply need to do is let's create the last function, which is just a function of deleting resumes, right? Delete resume, and then text in build context, and then resume ID, right? So to delete the resume, we need a resume ID. So let's go back inside our resume repository. Let's just change this to resume ID. And then let's change it to resume ID. All right, so now we are done with this method. Let's just make sure we just handle. So what we simply do is we'll simply handle the errors. So we're just going to return a switch statement. So that's another thing of using fp-dat for error handling, because it will allow us to use a switch statement to check if we have an error or if our request was successful. So if we have an error, we're simply going to throw that error, right? And then else, what we simply going to do is right, and then the value, and then final error, and then we are simply going to just show a snack bar. Which is going to be error.toString, right? All right, so now that we are done, we're done with this. So now what we simply need to do is we need to take care of our resume controller provider, right? Going to be an async notifier, notifier provider, takes in resume controller, then list resume model. And then we simply just return resume controller .new. All right, so now that we're done with this one, now we need another method for getting resume, right? Which is going to be a future provider family. So we'll use the family function because now we need to take in some parameters, right? Because we need to take in some parameters because we need the resume ID as our parameter. So it's going to be a list of resume model. Then the parameter that is going to return is going to be a string. All right, so now what we can simply do here is we can then pass in our reference and then our resume ID. Okay, so now that we're done with this, first we need to just create a resume function, resume, which is go to, we just need to watch our resume controller provider. And then we then use the notifier to just be able to access our get resumes, right? And then it's supposed to be, we are not supposed to pass in user ID there. And then we'll then pass in the resume ID, right? And then what we'll basically do is we'll simply return the resume. All right, so now that we are done, so now that we are sorry, it's supposed to be user ID because we are getting the resume using the user ID. So it's supposed to be user ID. So let's change it to user ID. All right, so now we are done with our controller. So basically now what we need to work on is we need to work on getting our resumes and also adding our resume, right? Okay, so now it's time for us to build our user interface. So let's go inside our screen and then we'll just create a resume screen.dat, right? And then if we move inside, we will go inside our utils folder under our route. What we are simply going to do here is I'm simply going to copy this and then I'm simply going to paste it below. And then I'm simply going to change it to resume screen, right? Resume screen. And then I'll also change also here to resume screen. And then basically what I'm simply going to do now is if we go to our main.dat file, let's go inside our main.dat file, and then here we'll simply pass in routes dot resume screen. And then we want it to direct to our resume screen, but we haven't finished with it. Let's go back inside our resume screen and then let's create a stateless widget and then let's rename it to resume screen, right? Like this. So if we go back inside here, resume screen. Okay, so now that we are done, let's go back inside our resume screen. And then so we are going to build this item here, right here. This item right here, we have the text title, which is resume, and then add resume. And then we have these cards here, right? So that's what we are going to be building. So let's just minimize here, right? So first of all, before we do that, let's go inside our settings screen. So under our resume camera, let's go down. We have this my resumes right here, right? So what we simply want to do is we want to wrap the settings item widget there with a gesture detector. So I want to wrap it with a gesture detector, and then if the user taps that, right? If the user taps our gesture detector, if it taps on our settings item widget, we want to redirect them to our resume screen, right? Navigator.push named, right? Push named, and then pass in the context, and then we pass in the routes dot. So let's import the routes here. And then routes dot resume screen. Okay. So now that we are done, all right. So now that we are done, well, basically what we need to do is let's go back and start working on our resume screen right there. Right. So we need the text. So if I just word reload, let's see. Yeah, as you can see. So let's change this to a scaffold widget. So now that we've changed it to a scaffold widget, if you were to load, you can see now. And then we also need an app bar, right? So we need an app bar, and then a bar, and then we also need a title. So our title is going to be a text, right? And then the text is going to be my resumes. And then so basically let's style the text. So give it a text style, and then the text style will we just give it a font size of 18, and then make sure that the font weight is font weight, and then bold font, right? So make sure that it's a bold font right there. So now if you can see now we have this my resume right there, and then actions. Now we need to pass in the actions, right? For our action, we need a text. So that text basically is going to be add resume, right? Add resume, and then we'll just style it, and text style, and then the color must be black, and also the font size must be 12. Give it like a font size of 12. Okay, so now if I were to load our application, now you can see we now have this text right there, but it's close to the edge of our screen. So I'm basically going to wrap it with the padding widget, right? So once we wrap it with the padding widget, now you can see now it's now appearing there, right? And then if we use our other emulator right there, so this other emulator, you can see that we have this card here, right? So we have this now card widget. So this card widget is the resume item widget, right? So what basically we need to do here is like, let's go inside our resumes screen widgets. So let's create a resume item widget. So let's give it it's going to be a stateless widget, right? And then let's name it resume item widget, right? So here going to check in a resume model, right? Resume model, and then since this is going to be a dynamic, we simply pass in resume model inside our resume widget, right? So now that we are done with this, right? So it's resume widget, right? And then so what we are simply going to do here is we are going to return padding widget. Simply going to return. So we're simply going to return a card widget, right? A card widget, and then we're simply going to give it a color of white. Okay, color of white, and then it's the child is going to be a size box. size box, and then we'll make sure that the height is somewhere around 113, right? And then let's make sure also that the child is going to be a row widget, then children. And then what we're simply going to do here is we are simply going to pass in the main axis alignment, right? So it's main axis alignment, and then main axis alignment dot space between, right? And then inside our row widget, what we simply have to do, the first thing that we need to pass in is this image here. So this image is going to be, we are going to wrap it with a clip right? Because we want it to have those rounded corners, right? So, and then we'll give it like a border radius, which is going to be a border radius dot circular, and then the border radius is just going to be 10. And then the child is going to be an image, and then asset, image.asset, and then we are going to simply pass in the assets folder / images. And then now what you're simply going to do is let's go to flat icon, right? So let's just search for PDF icon, right? So let's just use this one. You can grab any of your choice, right? So let's just grab this one, and then I'm simply going to copy this. Then let's go inside our assets folder, images, right? So I'm simply going to open it in my finder, and then here I'm simply going to paste it. And then I'm simply going to change it to name. I'm simply going to rename it to PDF icon, right? All right. So let's rename it. Okay, we already have another one, so let's just leave it there. We already had another one. All right, so what you simply do is, now we have this one, pdf.png, right? We have the pdf.png there, and then we have another one called PDF icon. We want to use the PDF icon, so / PDF icon .png. All right, so now that we are done with it, we'll simply give it a height 60, and then width of 60, right? And then we simply have to use the fit, which is going to be box fit dot fill, right there. And then we also need another text widget, right? So pass it another text widget, and then we're simply going to pass in the title. So it's going to be resume model title. And then if the title is null, we are simply going to pass in just an empty text, right? And let's delete. And let's make sure that the font size is 18, and then the font weight is going to be bold, right? Font weight to bold, and then color is going to be black, right? And then now we simply have another icon, right? We simply have another icon. So that icon is going to be an image dot asset, then assets, images. So let's check if we have the delete icon. Yeah, we have it. / delete icon.png. And then let's just make sure the height is 35, right? Height is 35. Then also the width is 35. And then now what you simply need to do is we are simply going to wrap this image with a get certificate. And then what we are simply going to do is so let's change this to consumer widget. And then let's pass in the widget reference inside our build function, right? And then let's just import Flutter Riverpod there. Okay. So it's saying what? Okay, it cannot start with an underscore. So let's just get rid of the underscore and then, all right. So now what we simply have to do here, we are going to just read our resume controller provider, right? So let's read it resume, and then we use the notifier function to be able to access the delete function, right? And then we'll simply delete our resume. Then we'll simply pass in the resume model .id, right? And then we're simply going to change that ID to string. Right, so now that we are done with our resume item widget, right? We are done with our resume item widget. Now what we can simply do is let's go back to our resume screen. So now inside our resume screen, what we simply need to do is let's change this to consumer widget. And then let's also pass in a widget reference. All right, so let's just import Flutter Riverpod. And then the first thing that we need is our user ID. So we are going to get our user ID from our local auth repository. And then also our resume, which is going to come from reference.watch get resume provider, right? Get resume provider. And then we'll simply pass in our user ID. Then we make sure that we convert the user ID to a string, right? Okay, so now that we are done with this, so what we now need to do is we need a body for our scaffold widget, right? So we need a body for our scaffold widget. So body. And then what we're simply going to do is resume dot when, we use the when function, and then when we're going to handle if we get the data. So the data is going to be our resume, right? And then error, if we have an error, simply going to handle an error, and then also a step trace. So we're simply going to return an error text if we have an error. then we'll simply convert our error to a string, right? And then loading will simply handle our loading. And then we'll simply return a loader right there, right? So basically what we are simply going to do here is, here we are simply going to return a safe area widget. Let's return a safe area widget, and then the child is going to be a single child scroll view, right? And then child is going to be a list view, builder, right? And then so under this list view builder, what we're simply going to do is make sure that shrink wrap is true. And then we also need to make sure that we provide a physics, and then we just make sure it's bouncing scroll physics. And then the item count is data.length, right? Item count is just going to be data.length, right? And then now basically what we are simply going to do after this is item builder. So our item builder takes in a context and an index, right? So it's going to take in a context and an index. And then after that, we are simply going to return so after this, we are simply going to return our resume item widget, right? So resume item widget, for resume model, we'll simply pass in a data and then the index, right? So now that we are done, okay, so now that we are done with this, we can simply now try to run our emulator and let's see, right? So let's just run our emulator, the other emulator, and then let's see. So let's see, there might be an error or something like that. So let's see. Saying that a none list. Okay, so let's go back inside our controller. So here we forgot to, we're supposed to return get resumes, and then what we simply have to do here is we simply have to pass in local auth expository dot user id dot toString, right? And then that's why we're getting an error, right? So now let's try to, yeah, you can see now our application is working. So let's go under settings and then my resumes. So let's just reload again, and then settings, and then my resumes, and then saying cast object file closure string function. So there might be an error somewhere. Okay, so let's see what's going on. Okay, so let's check. There might be an error. So let's first check our resume repository, right? Let's check our resume repository, getting resumes. So it's going to be URL and then get up.resume URL, and then pass in the user ID. Everything here is okay. And then let's go inside our resume controller. Okay guys, so the reason why we are getting this error right here, if we go to resume, is because if we go back inside our resume screen, get user ID, right, it's more of like it's an object, so we must, it's a function, right, that we are calling to get the user ID, right, from our local auth repository. So don't forget these parentheses, right? So after you do that, then you can just let's just reload our application and then let's run it. As you can see, now we have our our resumes right here, right? And you can also see, you can also delete a resume, of which you can also delete a resume, right? Of which the last thing that we need to do here is we need to just put a refresh indicator, right? So what we are simply going to do is we need to wrap around our safe area widget, right? So let's wrap around this safe area widget with a refresh indicator, right? Refresh indicator, and then on refresh, what you're simply going to do is we are simply going to call in reference.refresh, right? And then we'll pass in the resume, and then it's supposed to be resume dot, so get resume by get resume, right? Get resume provider, then we'll pass in the user ID, and then dot future, right? All right, so here let's just convert this to a string, right? So now we have refresh indicator. So as you can see, now we can refresh. The gesture is difficult by using a mouse. You actually need to like use your hands to pull to refresh, right? So as you can see now, yeah. So if we could pull, then it would refresh, but let's do it manually here. And then you can see now we have 2 resumes because we deleted another one. Yeah. So in the next video, we'll be working on the resume details page. And then after that, we'll then work on adding resume, right? Thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.